Recording progress.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. My name is Charnay Sanders. I serve as the program coordinator at COAC Detroit. And before we begin, I would like to thank you all just for taking this time. We know there's an abundance of videos out there and workshops for you to tune into, so we do not take it for granted that you did choose to tune into this one right here. And also recognizing those in our sector and working at community organizations, grassroots organizations, wear so many different hats. So for you to be able to just show up here, we definitely encourage you to be present and to just be able to put things on pause to really get the most out of this moment. We definitely invite you to get comfortable. Again, for those that are just coming in, feel free if you like to turn your camera on, or you can keep it off, whatever works well for you. Again, I work at COAC. For anyone who is unfamiliar, we are a resource hub that accelerates collaborative action in Southeast Michigan nonprofit community. And we serve as a connector, connecting people together to build relationships, share ideas, and co-create solutions. And we definitely do not do this work alone. COAC literally means to work together. So we're excited to do this in partnership today with the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network of Detroit. YNPN Detroit aims to promote a diverse and innovative next generation of leadership among social impact professionals in Metro Detroit by creating opportunities for networking, professional development, and community involvement to drive inclusive change in the city. So we're really excited to be partnering with them for this Social Impact Leaders series, which is a free series that we created to really support with enhancing the professional development and leadership skills of emerging leaders and nonprofit professionals in the region. And we're so thrilled. I think this is a very honor to have Dr. David Brown Jr. as our facilitator for this session. And the beautiful thing about Zoom is he's based in New York. We're currently based in Detroit. So to be able to connect through this nation and just being able to do this virtually is something I never get tired of. So I'm really grateful for Zoom in this matter, for being able to connect us together. And Dr. David Brown Jr., he currently serves as an executive coach, author, consultant, and authenticity, let me get that word correct, thought leader. He has over 10 years of experience as a senior operations leader in Fortune 500 companies across the financial services, professional services, and facilities management industries. His passion for operations, change management, leadership, and organizational development has made him adapt at turnarounds and transformational change initiatives. Despite growing success in his career, a personal tragedy became the catalyst for David to make a professional transition that sparked a search for deeper meaning of how he could contribute to the development of leaders and organizations. So today we are so grateful to have him pour into our development as leaders and learning how we can manage our social impact careers in a way that increases personal satisfaction and aligns to a sense of purpose. So please join me in a physical or virtual round of applause through the reaction button on your Zoom screen as we welcome David to the virtual stage. Thank you, David. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Charnay. That was incredible. First of all, let me pull up my screen. All right. Okay, so you guys should all be able to see that. So first of all, I really appreciate everybody choosing to join in this co-creative experience, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you. I want to thank Charnay and Lauren and Robin and Kyla for helping to make this happen. And as I was pulling together content for today's session, I reflected on how early in my career, even in the middle of my career, how I would attend training and workshops like these. And sometimes you had what I call a talking head, right, who was out sort of touting their credentials, sharing information. And as I thought about preparing for this, because you guys have seen the bio, I really don't want to focus on what some may call like accomplishments and those sort of things, because we tend to use them to qualify people, right? And so before we even get into the session, we've already sort of made a bit of a determination about what we think we may receive. And at least that was my experience. And really my goal here is to really connect with you guys human to human, right? Not even as professionals, but human to human, because as we talk about authenticity, what I want to encourage you to do is to expand your thinking about who you are and how that can really play a role in it, not only advancing your career, but also advancing your life. My personal opinion is that this perspective is a bit cutting edge, and I'll talk a little bit about that because one, nobody's doing this yet, right? And I think the times of change that we're sort of going through, all these systems are shifting as things are sort of shaking out. And I believe, based on my experience, which I'll share with you, that you'll see how this can really be transformative, not only in your career, but also in your life. And my intention is that whatever resonates with you, that you take it away and you use it to support in making career choices that help you to feel more comfortable, help you to feel more confident, and most importantly, help you to feel more authentic. All right, so let's go to our first slide. So everything's changing, right? The world is literally changing around us. All of us have been impacted by COVID. As a consequence or an outcome of that, how we think about work is changing, right? As we move to more remote hybrid work, right? The Great Resignation, I'm sure most of you have heard about that. That is happening, and that is going to continue to happen as people choose to opt out of their current positions or even opt out of the workforce altogether. For groups that have been marginalized for many years, diversity, equity, and inclusion is top of mind for everybody, right? So how do we usher more people of color, more women, more members of the LGBTQ community, more veterans? How do we usher them into positions to where organizations actually do reflect the collective customers that they serve, and not just a very specific demographic that sort of holds sort of all the perceived control and power? And then lastly, there's a lot of focus on compensation, specifically equitable compensation, which again is sort of changing dynamics. I highlight these 5 things because they're impacting so many people, right? And as it impacts large groups of people, these experiences become catalysts in how organizations think about attracting, developing, and retaining talent. So when I say what I want to offer is cutting edge, it's because everything that we know today is all changing, right? And nobody has a magic bullet to understand what it's going to look like. But my hope is that what I offer you will give you a lens that you can use to sort of follow sort of your path forward, again, using authenticity as a bit of a guidepost. So with that said, when we do work, right, oftentimes we are doing something because we want to feel successful, right? And so one of the things I would like to engage you guys in, if you wouldn't mind going into the chat and just answer this question. You know, if you could use 1 or 2 words, how do you define success? And I'll give you a moment to do that. And then in a minute, I will come back to it. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, right? And so I'll tell you about my early career experience, which I define as a linear sort of path towards executive leadership, right? And so I started my undergrad career at University of Delaware. Actually, I went to a smaller business school first, transferred to University of Delaware in 1998, where I studied psychology and eventually switched to finance. At the same time that I matriculated, I also started working at a credit card bank, which ultimately got gobbled up by JP Chase. So that was in August of 1998. And so I was working full time, taking 12, 15 credits as well. So doing classes in the morning, afternoon, working Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. And during my experience at the credit card bank, I had a chance to see customer service, collections, and underwriting. Took on some really interesting assignments, some relocation assignments, got some early leadership experience, which was really transformative for me. And in 2008, I decided that I wanted to get an MBA. And so I did Villanova's executive MBA program. And the big part of the reason why I chose that was because if you looked at all of the executives at the bank, they all had MBAs, right, from pretty good schools. And so when I talk about a linear path, it's very cause and effect sort of focus. You do this, this is the outcome you expect, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was how I really managed my career and really had my experienced myself professionally. Eventually, I decided to leave JP Morgan. This was in 2010. I did some work at Deloitte Consulting for about a year. After the financial crisis, I was working with a large financial services institution that was really knee deep and all those toxic mortgage assets. So really sort of interesting work, but got burned out after 12 months. I traveled so much, I needed to take a break. And so I got recruited by a facilities company who wanted a former consultant who also had a lot of operations leadership experience. They were trying to combine 3 organizations together. And so I took that assignment. And at that point, you notice that I say pre-2013, right? It's sort of the timeline. That was my career up into that point. And so I had a very clear trajectory in terms of where I was going. My mentors were helping to, again, prescribe how I needed to get ahead. Then life happened, right? So in early 2012, I met a young woman who lived in the Philadelphia area for about 10 years. Her and her family had come from Uzbekistan, and I fell madly in love. We got pregnant. We dated hot and heavy, super quick. We got married like 3 months after knowing each other because we found out that she was pregnant. And then that led to this beautiful human sort of being brought into the planet. And this is my daughter, Layla, and this is her at 9 months. And so that was a life-changing experience, as many of us, right? When life happens, it ends up impacting who we are professionally, right? But this is a little bit of a different story, right? Because it wasn't just the birth of her that changed me. The birth of her also changed the relationship that I had with my wife at the time. And so what became clear was we had very different views on how to manage money. We had very different views on how to manage healthcare, all those really critical things. And so fast forward to October of 2013, she and I, we agree that we're going to get divorced at the end of the year, and we decide to live separately. We actually never got to that point because in November of 2013, she left the country and she went back home and she took my daughter, her and her mother. And so for me, obviously I was shattered. My family was heartbroken as well. And so my way of beginning to heal from that, and it started literally like the day after I found out that she had left, was I began to write little letters and notes to my daughter, just saying, hey, I can't wait to see you, those sort of things. Super, super cathartic. And I did that for a couple of weeks. And after about 2 weeks, and keeping in mind, my daughter's about 11 months at the time, after about 2 weeks, she comes to me in this dream. And in the dream, she's like 4 or 5 years old, and she's wearing this white little lacy dress, these white patent leather shoes. And she comes up, she hops in my lap, she kisses me on the cheek, and she says, everything is going to be okay. And I woke up the next day and I'm like, what in the world just happened? Because it was like she was there with me physically, like I could just feel her. And so the second thing that happened was, as I went off to work, I realized that I had a sense of peace that just wasn't there the day before. And I started to understand that my wife at the time, her choice based out of fear really had nothing to do with me. And so I was able to begin to sort of separate myself emotionally from the outcome of what I'd experienced. And so about a month or so after that, I was meditating, and I've been an avid meditator since about 2011. And in front of me, I saw these 8 sort of words just sort of floating. And it was things like gratitude and compassion and acceptance and loving unconditionally and forgiveness. And I'm like, what does all this mean, right? But I wrote it down intuitively, and I came to it later, and I realized that these 8 words were what helped me to find peace, because I was experiencing them on such a deep level that I really just didn't comprehend it. And so I decided to take those words. I wrote my daughter new letters, which I eventually turned into a book that sort of shares this whole story. And my thought behind that was, not only was it healing for me to write the book, but also if I never saw my daughter again, it was important to me that she knew how I felt about her, right? And I didn't know, her mother was so angry, didn't know or couldn't control what she was going to say to her, right? So all this happens in 2013. And so all of a sudden, like, my professional career was sort of on the back burner for a minute. But who I was becoming was the important part, right? It's sort of what happens after the tragedy that you become aware of. What it opens becomes the critical part. And so my professional career started to become very different, right? Because I realized that there was so much, one, that I had to offer, but I was having this very sort of unique experience that at the moment I couldn't explain it. And my colleagues and friends and family couldn't explain it either. But I ended up going back to Chase in 2014. I took a big job, and this big job, I was managing almost 100 people, 100 professionals, leaders, and we were supporting about a 1,500 person operations during a time of significant regulatory change. And I was sort of the regulatory guy, the risk and control guy. And it was a super stressful situation. My manager, as brilliant as she was really difficult to work with. And I woke up one Monday morning and I felt like a 200-pound person was sitting on my chest and I couldn't catch my breath. And my family has a history of heart issues. And the first thing I thought was I was having a heart attack. And I was like 37 at the time. And so I call my doctor, I go to see her. She immediately takes me out of work for about 3 weeks, run all the battery of tests for your heart. Thankfully, nothing came back, but she said, hey, you had an anxiety attack. And so I said, well, look, I'm open to seeing somebody, right? Because I want to get to the root of what's creating all of this. And so she prescribed me to see a therapist. First session, I tell her the story about my daughter, and at the time, my ex-wife. I talked to her about what's happening at work. And at the end of the session, she said the most profound thing, because I was almost done the book at the time. And she said to me, David, have you ever considered applying these 8 principles from your book to your manager and the workplace? It was like mind-blowing. I went back the next week to see her again, and she was like, you're like a different person. And I was like, yeah, because my perspective had changed again. And so I went back to work, and my coworkers were, how come you don't hate her anymore? And what I realized was that she was creating all this fear because she's fearful. And again, that has nothing to do with me. And so I was able to separate myself from that. And ultimately, on Mother's Day of 2015, I sat down with my mom and I was like, hey, I'm going to quit my job this week. and she was like, well, first of all, why? What are you going to do for money? This is something that you've always wanted. And I said, yeah, but at the end of the day, I was like, something magical is happening to me that I don't understand, but I need to pursue it because I feel like I can help a lot of people. And to me, that gave me such a deep sense of purpose versus the things that I was sort of focused on, right? And so I eventually left Chase, and I decided to get into coaching. I got trained as a coach. And after about 18 months, I ran out of money, like completely ran out of money. And so I was like, dude, this is not working out for me. And at the time, I went back to work. I decided to take a job at Prudential, a much more junior position, but I was also coaching at the same time on a part-time basis. And one day, randomly on a Sunday, I met a gentleman at Panera Bread, and he came up behind me. I had a really nice car at the time, and he was like, hey, that's a really nice car. How do you like it? We started chatting. He was asking me what I did for work, and I explained my transition out of corporate America and getting into coaching and this book that I'd written. And he was really intrigued by the book and how I wanted to take these principles and apply them to leadership. And so he had told me that he had retired from a big chemical company. He was like, I really am interested in staying connected. And so the following week, I reached out to him. We decided to connect. And not only had this guy just retired from this big company, but he reported to the CEO, right? And he was head of strategy for the company. And we actually formed a coaching relationship. And so I coached him for about 9 months. And after the 9 months, I remember him sitting me down, and he said, in all of my career, when I look at the culmination of all the training and development that I've received, he said, the past 9 months with you supersede that in terms of my growth. He's like, it changes how I show up in the boardroom. It changes how I connect with colleagues. It changes my relationship with my wife. It's changed the relationship with with my kids. And he said, as a token of gratitude, I want you to know that I added you to my will. I was like, wow. Yeah. So, and how much none of that's really relevant, but the fact that he made that gesture because of the impact through the coaching was really, really powerful. And what we were focusing on was this idea of personal and professional selves being different, and how when you are in one environment, you feel like you can't bring all of who you are sort of to the table, and we find ourselves sort of moving and vacillating back and forth. And so what he encouraged me to do was to actually ground what I was doing and understanding in research. And that's what led me to Temple, where I did a 3-year doctoral program, where I was introduced to the concept of authenticity. So when I think about the experience with my daughter and ex-wife, and what that opened up for me was a completely different set of possibilities around how I can not only experience my career, but just how I experience life in general, right? And how I can use that to help teach and support others who are interested in having a different type of experience, if you will. Now, so what did I learn from all of that, right? So when I think about the early part of my career, everything felt very prescribed, right? In terms of how I was operating. My mentors gave me sort of here's the path to get to where you want to be, right? But one of the challenges with that was I never considered what's happening for me personally, right? And how I bring that to bear when I come into the workplace, right? And how do I consider that into my own development, right? Because early on, those things were just different, right? They were just very, very separate parts of me. And when I talk about the linear approach, I think about cause and effect, and how that creates all these limitations, right? Because we're so focused on, well, I've got to do this in order to create this outcome, right? And it's like operating with blinders. And one of the biggest challenges were that as I'm being guided by mentors and other colleagues, is if I was doing those things and I didn't get the outcome that I wanted, that was a big dissatisfier for me, right? Well, what do you mean I'm not ready for the next job, right? I did everything you told me to do, right? So that was early on. And going back to the question around success, and let me see what you guys put into the chat. Oh, look at that. You guys are so much better than I was early on in my career. Growth, setting goals and executing them, achieving what you set out to achieve. This is beautiful. Well, I guess it makes sense too, because the industry you guys are in versus us left brain folks in financial services. But for me, early on, success was defined by the titles that I held. It was defined by how much money I made, right? And what I realized was there was never enough of any of that, right? And so it's like being in sort of this perpetual hamster wheel, because every time I achieved a new title or made more money, there was always more money to be made. There was always a new title to achieve, right? And so again, that was, I understand now that was my own need to be validated, because at a deeper level, I didn't feel good about who I was, right? And that was a lesson that came a little bit later. But as I think about the second half of my career, I began to integrate really who I was into the work that I was doing, right? And when I began to do that, I started to understand that I wasn't fitting into the environment that I was in. And as I really reflected on my career, it's like every job that I had was about trying to free myself from limitations. But despite that, me having that perspective now, what I do realize that all of those experiences have served me, right? Because they've all served me to hold the perspective that I hold today, and to have more gratitude for the experience I'm having today based on the pain and the challenges that I felt in the past. What I also recognize, especially over the past 5 years, is that my level of personal and professional fulfillment is like through the roof. And now how I think about success is very different. You know, I'm less focused on the work and more focused on how it makes me feel, right? So I focus on happiness, I focus on peace, and I focus on joy. I focus on being in the flow. And so as long as those things are happening, and I find ways to sort of, when I'm not feeling in the flow, sort of jumping back in, I feel like I'm being successful, if you will. And then the last thing was, I realized that you can't really ever escape who you truly are, right? And so if you're feeling authentic, and we'll get to that in a second, right? You feel good, right? That's who you truly are. But also, if you find yourself in a situation that doesn't feel good, right? The fact that you don't feel good tells you something about who you are, right? And so embracing that becomes important, and figuring out how do you make pivots and changes to get yourself back into a place that ultimately feels good. So I feel like over my past, 23 or so years, there's been a lot learned from the contrast of experiences that I've had. One is sort of the old sort of corporate way, in my opinion, and then sort of the past 5 years has been really a reflection of what I'm calling sort of this cutting edge perspective. All right, so now let's switch and sort of talk about authenticity, right? So I'm going to ask you to jump back into the chat again, and if you can answer this question with a few words, in your opinion, what does it mean to be authentic? Ooh, true to self, true to yourself. Go ahead, Jennifer. True to yourself no matter what. Strengths and weaknesses proudly, yes. Ooh, Hannah, I like that. Awesome. So Hannah, I'm gonna show you a visual in a minute that directly aligns to that, I believe. So from an authenticity perspective, one, humans have been trying to understand authenticity for millennia, right? And so there are roots in philosophy, literature, religion, psychology, all around what it means to be authentic. And so one of the most well-known quotes comes from Socrates, which is "be true to thine own self," right? And then Shakespeare sort of took that and sort of used very similar language in Hamlet. So there's a lot of words here, but I'm going to cover this quickly. And I know that Charnay is going to give you guys copies of the slides, so you can look at the details if you want. But as part of my doctoral work, I studied authenticity, and I really ran across this construct of authentic leadership. And so that's where I began sort of my journey. And so a couple things I just want to highlight for you. One, when it comes to authentic leadership, there's really interest by both academics and practitioners, which is important. So that's not just sort of a theoretical thing. There's also a very practical piece that people want to understand. There's been research that has been done, which is kind of stalled. And one of the reasons why it's stalled is because academics and practitioners couldn't come up with a consistent definition, right? And so what I wanted to do as part of my research was, if authenticity is not well understood, combining it with leadership makes it that much more complex to understand, because leadership is sometimes an abstract concept. So breaking the two apart for me made a lot of sense. So I focused on studying authenticity specifically in the context of leadership, right? And what I found was that leaders that experience high levels of authenticity were able to actually change and transform the environments of their organizations in every situation, right? And then there were some additional sort of outcomes as a result of that as well. But where I ended up landing was with 3 definitions around authenticity. One I call individual, one I call collective, and then one that I call manifested. And I'm going to focus on the first 2, right? So I'm going to leave sort of manifested for another time. And the reason why there are multiple definitions is because what matters is who or what is being determined to be authentic, and who is determining whether that thing or person is authentic or not. And so there are different lenses to understand what authenticity means. And so hopefully this will resonate with you guys. All right. Okay. So Hannah, this sort of goes to what you were saying around alignment. So the first level of authenticity I call individual authenticity. And what I'm talking about are 2 different mechanisms that are constantly working for us. So one is an intrinsic component, which is your internal thoughts, values, and beliefs, and the relationship to your external actions and behaviors, right? And so when those 2 mechanisms feel aligned or closer, you feel more authentic. When they feel further apart, you feel less authentic, right? And I think all of us can probably attest to being in a meeting or something like that, and you have a thought that you want to share and you choose not to share it, right? And just think about how that made you feel, right? Or vice versa, right? Where you are willing to put out whatever it is that you have to offer. That is a higher level of authenticity. And because these mechanisms are always working, right? Because there's always been a debate about, whether authenticity is black and white, it's like either or is it more shades of gray, right? So I talk about authenticity existing on this continuum of high and low. And so it means you're always authentic all the time because you're always thinking, you're always being, right? If you will, it's just a matter of to what degree. And what I'll show you next is how your environment and the context really influences that. All right, second level of authenticity, collective authenticity. So just like individuals, collective groups of people have shared thoughts, values, and beliefs. And from those shared thoughts, values, and beliefs come an expected set of actions or behaviors, right? So you're expected to act a certain way when you're a part of a group. And you can use this for any group or any label if you so choose. So what ends up happening is, as individuals, we now have two different dimensions to view our own authenticity, right? So personally, we're looking, I'm not sure if you guys can see my little cursor, but personally, you're internally thinking about your own thoughts, values, and beliefs, and your external actions and behaviors. But then there's this relationship to the group that you have to consider. The problem is this, is that on an individual basis, in terms of who determines the level of authenticity, it can only be you. And the reason why it can only be you is because you're the only one who has access to your internal thoughts, values, and beliefs, unless you choose to share it, right? And even in that, you don't have access to all of it because we all act unconsciously, right? So it's only what you're aware of, right, that you can truly have a reference point in terms of your level of authenticity, right? So as a result, right, because a third party is only looking at your actions and behaviors, and what they're doing is they're comparing that to their own internal thoughts, values, and beliefs, right? Which is all about you being someone that someone else wants you to be, right? Versus you having the freedom to be who you choose to be. And many of us sort of get caught in this dilemma. So at the end of the day, on an individual basis, you determine your own level of authenticity. When it comes to the collective and being a part of a group, right? So there is the expected actions and behaviors. Who determines whether you're in alignment to that? It's other members of the group, right? So now all of a sudden, someone outside of you is determining whether you fit or not, right? And we see this socially all the time, right? So what does it mean to be a corporate citizen, or what does it mean to be an employee here, right? And so what happens is oftentimes, because the members of the group are determining whether I fit or not, we will find ourselves in conflict, right? Who I want to be versus who I'm expected to be, right? And now the beautiful thing is that collective authenticity is socially constructed, right? And because it's socially constructed, we can choose to do something different. We can set up a different set of values and beliefs around what it means to be a part of this group, right? But to me, this relationship between individual and collective authenticity explains any resistance that you may have in any group that you're a part of. So whether it's your organization and feeling like you're not fitting, right? Whether it is your family, whether it's your relationship with friends, whether it's your gender, whether it's your race, it doesn't matter. Any label that you choose to say that you're a part of a certain group, you run the possibility of being in conflict in that. Hopefully all that makes sense. And so what does that have to do with authenticity? And managing your career? So the alignment between your individual and collective authenticity is mission critical for feeling good about whatever it is that you choose to do, right? So when we are in that space of feeling like we connect with the group that we're a part of, the environment that we're in, the people that we're working with, and we feel like we can be a truer version of ourselves, right? There's nothing sort of like that. There's nothing more important than that. And when you're in that space of higher authenticity, we know based on the research that it leads to better performance, right? People are more productive, they're more creative, they trust one another, there's more transparency, there's higher engagement, and there's less energy exertion, right? Think about how many times based on your environment, whether it's your relationship with your manager, with your coworkers, or what have you, that you spend energy trying to manage the relationship to be something different, right? That's powerful. All of a sudden, it's no longer about the work that's being done, right? Because that relationship is taking on a life of its own, right? But when you're in this space of alignment, it all sort of, people call it being in the flow. It all happens much, much easier. Also, we know that when we feel connected to something bigger, that it creates a much larger sense of purpose, right? And so going back to the epiphany I had when I was speaking to my mother, I was almost moved to tears during that conversation, because I was like, I don't know what this purpose looks like, but I know what I'm feeling, right? And yeah, she couldn't necessarily relate, and that's okay. But for me, like that connection, and for many others, that connection to purpose is really, really important. And related to that, there's research on what's called purpose fit, which is employees fit to the purpose of an organization. We know that that shows a higher level of employee satisfaction. And so when I think about authenticity and managing your career, right, these aspects become really, really important. And ultimately, not that, and I have a little note here that, you know, the typical knowledge, skills, and abilities, do you have the requirements to do the job? Yes, those things are important. But my message to you is that these components of authenticity are more important, right? Because it's going to lead you to a much, much higher level of satisfaction that goes beyond just the work that you're doing every day. Thanks for the time check, Lauren. All right, so I've got a couple of tips and suggestions that I'd like to share with you guys that may get sort of your juices flowing about how to navigate your career more authentically. So the first thing is a bit of introspection, right? So taking inventory of what feels good to you versus what doesn't. And I think about that on a couple of different levels. So you have the tactical, here's the job that I'm required to do. Does that feel good? Does it not feel good, right? And then there's the bigger question, which is the context, right? The environment that I'm in, the people that I'm working with, the mission of the organization. Does that feel good to me anymore or not, right? And being willing to, based on what comes up for you, being willing to make changes or to think about making changes to align yourself to something that feels better. So again, about moving from individual authenticity and collective authenticity to be much more closely linked. Second thing is pursue what makes your heart sing. Ultimately, I think when we join, most of us, when we join the workforce, we start to develop our independence, right? Especially financially. Next thing you know, 10, 15, 20 plus years later, you realize that the work that you're doing isn't satisfying, right? And so I think with the Great Resignation, a lot of people are beginning to see that, right? Because COVID has been so disruptive. It's like, wait a minute, am I really happy with what I've been doing? You know, but in life, you might find yourself in debt or with children or have other obligations that you can't just sort of step away from. And so you feel stuck. So I encourage you now to start thinking early about what those deep desires are for you, and not only your career, but for your life, right? So dream big and find opportunities that feed the passion that you want to ultimately pursue. 3, the picture may not always be clear, right? It's okay to not have every answer, right? No one on this earth knows exactly how everything's going to unfold, right? I had a path that I was pursuing early on in my career and it felt good, right? But I also had setbacks, right? And it wasn't until much later that I began to realize how all those experiences sort of served me in sort of holding the perspective that I had today, right? So I encourage you to pause when you don't feel clear, right? There's nothing that you need to do, right? And there's nothing more powerful than being able to let go of your own ego and desire to have to do something, right? Because we want to feel comfortable, right? So you don't have to have the answer to everything. And so this sort of leads me to my next tip, which is when it comes to clarity, right? I'm not only talking about our understanding of it, which is sort of the brain, but also the feeling of it, which is more of the heart. And so even when we don't know what we don't know, sometimes you just know, right? That's your intuition, right? Sort of talking to you. And one way better to understand that experience is when doors begin to open for you easily, right? I almost look at it as like the universe is sort of extending an invitation, right? And I know for me, I began to really just follow those paths, right? Without second guessing it. And what I found is that I've always been led to a much, much better place, a much more fulfilling place as well. And step 5, which is the last step, is to be comfortable with the change, right? We all can see that the world's in flux, right? And many aspects of our individual worlds are in flux, right? So try your best to get comfortable with the change as we sort of have to ride this out, right? And be comfortable with considering opportunities that you might not have considered in the past, right? Be comfortable just trying something new. Being open and willing to change is the most important part of not only navigating your career, but also navigating your life, right? Because everything is always changing. So the more you understand that, right, the more you can align with the flow of wherever you ultimately get called to. So, so you might have noticed that I discussed sort of career and life sort of simultaneously, right? And that's by design, because to me, they really are all integrated. It's all one part of you, right? So I'll leave you with this quote, right? Designing your career and designing your life are one and the same. Choosing to treat them as mutually exclusive is choosing a limiting perspective. Because again, if we're choosing one versus the other, we're beginning to separate them out, and we'll have to be someone different, right, in our careers versus in our lives. So I encourage you to open yourself up to whatever possibilities present themselves to you, and just know that wherever you go, you're in the right place. But I hope that these sort of broader perspectives around authenticity, that you choose to apply some of them, if not all of them, in whatever you choose to pursue professionally and personally. So with that said, I will open it up to turn over to you, Charnay. Do you want to talk a little bit about Q&A and getting it started?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you very much, David, for this amazing session so far. That was wonderful. Now we're going to move into the Q&A. I know there were some questions that was previously submitted, so we can walk through answering a few of those. And also, if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand using the raise your hand feature on the reactions if you would like to vocally say it, or you can always drop it in the chat. But maybe we could start with some of the questions that was previously addressed. David, if it's fine, I could take the 2 that was a little bit more for some of that I can answer on behalf of COACT.
Okay, perfect. So I'll start with the first one, which is I'd like to learn more about networking. So I'll give you sort of a little bit of a tidbit, because I think networking, there's an art and a science to it that can get pretty complex. But I will share this, that ultimately, networking with intention is important for mobility purposes, right? I think one of the issues, well, before I get to issues, finding out where you need to be connected, right, based on where you desire to go and what you desire to do is important, right? So finding out people within your network, people that are connected to people within your network, those are all really important. Finding groups that support sort of the vision of where you're going becomes important as well. One of the biggest pitfalls I see in networking, though, is that people do it too late, right? Because they decide to network because they have a need now. And so they're trying to fulfill that need. And so as a result, they're not bearing the fruits. So when I think about my network, it's pretty deep and it's extensive, but it's been something that I've developed over a long period of time, right? And there's also a sense of trust that has been developed within those relationships. And there's a reciprocity. So when people need something from me, I'm willing to offer, right? So it can't be sort of one-sided. Well, oh, I want to network with you because I want something, right? That doesn't work, right? These are genuine relationships that I've built over time. So it requires a certain amount of patience as well. So I'll sort of leave it there for networking, but I'm more than happy whoever submitted the question to also have a conversation offline if you'd like more clarification. Trina, you want to cover the next two?
Yep. So for the next two, I'm going to also drop some quick solutions in the chat. So there was some questions about just technical assistance and fundraising. I'm really excited today. Actually, it's the first day we're launching the KIPD Plus applications. They've launched today. So we actually have some info sessions, one today and one coming up in next month. So I definitely point you in that direction. That is really to help fund transformative neighborhood projects that support the vision, creativity, and priorities of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park residents. So if that applies to you, whoever asked the question, please also look into that, as well as just get connected on our newsletter. So you can just go to our Collect Detroit website and we will share funding opportunities as well as those hosted by some of our partners. So please, that will be the immediate response. Also for Collab Connect. So for technical assistance, we do work with various amazing service providers that are partners to our organization to really kind of help co-create solutions. So it's a free 45-minute consultation. You can schedule that right on our website. And then the last one, I know there was someone that kind of mentioned that they work for a for-profit organization and have challenges that drive with a social mission. So for this one, I would just recommend that we have in the past had our corporate social responsibility series that was really geared toward kind of creating a audience that was just various sectors, so nonprofit, for-profit, etc. And we have those recordings on our virtual resource library. So I will be sure to drop that link. But if you have any more specific questions, so we kind of get a better understanding of those specific challenges, you can do a direct message to me now, or you can just follow me via email and I'll be happy to go more hand in hand for that. For the sake of time, I'll just drop that link for the replays. Thank you, David. I'll let you cover the other ones. And if anything else comes up, please feel free to refer to myself or Lauren from YMP in Detroit.
Awesome. Thank you. So the next question was related to code switching. So very familiar with that concept. And actually what I find is that idea of collective authenticity actually ties to code switching as well, right? To where people show up differently in one environment versus the next. And I think, in my opinion, code switching it's almost like a coping mechanism, right? In order to fit into the environment that you're in. And what I'm proposing is, yeah, we should be aware of that. But as you experience higher and higher levels of authenticity, what my theory shows is that you have less of a need to code switch, right? Because what happens is you can be who you are independent of context, right? And so that's sort of the ultimate goal from a humanity perspective. Whether we ever get there or not, I'm not sure, right? Because we are all very much sort of impacted by the environments that we're in. And let me know in the chat if there's anything else around code switching that you'd like me to touch base upon. Question 5 and 8 looks like they're the same. So developing authentic relationships with coworkers. Trina, was the question more specific around that, or like whether it's strategies or just to speak on it?
Yeah, just to speak on it more generally. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I like to use the term that we all have tribes, right? So we all have people that we feel connected to, right? What's interesting though is when we think about tribes, we think about only the relationships that feel good, right? But the reality is that even the relationships that don't feel good, it's still sort of a reflection of who you are, right? So there's still something to sort of take away from that. But developing authentic relationships with coworkers, it varies, right? Depending upon where you are and where your coworkers are, right? And what I find is that it's really important to recognize where people are, right? So in your own awareness, recognizing that maybe someone's just not ready for what you have to offer, right? And that's okay, right? Because that's the journey that they're ultimately choosing. But what you will find is that the more and more that you embrace your own authenticity, right? Because that is the inward journey, as you reflect that out, it changes the people around you, right? It changes the environment. So going back to what I discovered in my research, the leaders who were experiencing and demonstrating higher authenticity, they changed the environment because the followers changed, right? So the followers began to change their own values and beliefs. And so they began to have a different experience, right? Now, it's important to understand that you won't necessarily build strong relationships with every coworker, right? That's sort of just how the journey, right? Because we're not there. I don't know if there'll ever be a time we're all sort of on the same page, because we're all choosing different perspectives as we move forward. But by being the most authentic version of yourself, you will by default begin to create more authentic relationships with people that you work with. Leading with vulnerability, I thought this was a great one. Again, in my research, most of the folks that I interviewed, there were like 15 of them, when they talked about their journey in corporate America, and they, some of them were in startups, others were in big Fortune 100 companies. They all had sort of the same path, because for the most senior folks, they were all around the same demographic, sort of late 40s to mid 60s. And so they all learned to sort of play the game. And in playing the game, especially early in their career, they began to get ahead, right? But there was a point in their career, an inflection point, where they all became aware that they didn't care anymore. Like they felt like they had built up enough cachet, enough of a reputation that they could take a risk. And what they did was they began to reveal more of themselves. They brought more of themselves to the workplace. They were more vulnerable. They shared more about who they were personally. And as they began to do that, that's what began to change their teams, right? That was what began to precipitate the shifting of shared values across the organizations that they worked in, right? So being vulnerable becomes super important from an authenticity perspective. It also, if you think about high authenticity and low authenticity, there's also sort of an inverse relationship to the ego, right? So the higher your level of authenticity, the more you are yourself, but there's also an understanding or awareness of the greater good, which is actually not about you, right? So it's high authenticity is low ego, low authenticity is high ego, right? So as you think about leading, being vulnerable, you're not worried about how people perceive you, right? And what that does is as you extend yourself that way to people, they feel safe to do the same thing. Last question that we had from the earlier questions, expanding on what is professional, white, hetero, middle-class work culture. Well, all that is breaking down right now, right? That is what we are all witnessing, which I think is amazing in a lot of ways, but keeping in mind that it's, again, everything serves, right? So the current systems are created with that sort of mindset or set of values in mind, right? That's what we've been operating in. The challenge is that it's created all of these, depending on who you ask, unintended or intended consequences, right? So where you've got issues like distribution of wealth is sort of all out of whack, right? We are hyper-focused on very specific things, and a few people make out better than everybody else. And I'd even argue that even they're suffering tremendously. But in terms of sort of traditional society's view on success and power and wealth, right? A small fraction of people are sort of winning, if you will, and then everybody else is sort of trying to figure it out. My view of just our expansion as humans is that everything is moving towards integration, right? And so you're seeing this as it relates to race, you're seeing it in terms of gender, right? You're seeing it all over the place. And this sort of context is no different, right? So going back to the first slide about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Once you begin to bring more women and more people of color to the table to make decisions, you are going to create a different outcome, right? which, by the way, is the third definition of manifested authenticity, is that the products and services that you create are a reflection of the collective, right? So if you've got this old sort of way of thinking about what it means to be professional, you're going to create certain outcomes of that, right? And that's what the corporate culture that many of us have operated in, right? But as you have other sort of representation stepping into these leadership roles, our definition of what's professional is going to change, right? I think it's also going to change because of how we're choosing to work. I almost wore a hoodie today because I was like, dude, I'm just going to be who I am. That's what I was wearing earlier. So, so why not, right? But I think those definitions are sort of, I don't want to say under attack, but it is shifting, right? And the piece that no one knows is what is it ultimately going to become? And again, going back to this cutting edge perspective, it's being aware that these things are happening. And so there's going to be a time where it feels like unstable, right? Until we sort of develop a quote unquote new normal, right? But you're going to have some organizations that are going to adopt different professional standards faster than others. But eventually it has to change, right? Because so many people are demanding something different, right? And in my mind, people are sort of stepping into their own power. And that is why we are beginning to create sort of a different set of outcomes.
Thank you so much, David, for answering those questions. I actually wanted to uplift one, if we still have the time, that was dropped in the chat live. The question was, what advice do you have for identifying next career steps and long-term goals? I'm happy with where I'm at and where I'm headed, but don't want to miss any opportunities for growth. If you can address that question.
Yeah, and Hannah, I'll extend an invitation for you if you want to have a one-on-one, because there's a couple of different things to unpack in detail there. So one, when you think about what I'd want to understand is sort of how you define growth, right? Because if growth is about new experiences or expansion, you can do that in an infinite number of ways, right? And so that is sort of one perspective that I just want to offer. So I'd want to probably learn a little bit more about what area specifically you're looking to grow in. The second thing is, when it comes to sort of managing career steps, I like to think about the end in mind, right? And what I've learned to do is sort of keep the end sort of, I think about it more in concepts versus being exactly something very specific. Why? Because one, you never know when you're going to get there, right? And two, everything is always changing, right? So your definition of it may look very different. So I know for me, I always wanted to be a COO because I thought that, that was a provocative sort of title and it'd be cool to sort of lead that many people, right? That was my understanding. Eventually I became a COO and it wasn't any of that. Right? And I'm like, I don't want to work for anybody else, right? So it all sort of changed, right? So, but starting with the end in mind and having some sense of clarity as to what it may look and feel like, and then working backwards on the career steps. Because what you can do is you can do a bit of a gap analysis that says, okay, here's the end goal. I want to run this type of business. And you can think about what are the, again, knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to do that effectively. And then you can compare where you are, right? And then understand what the gap is, right? And then that leads to, well, what are the things I need to develop? What sort of assignments do I need to get those experiences? Do I need to make connections in a space that, I don't have any connections in, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely a much deeper conversation that I'm more than happy to have with you.
And we are 1 minute past the hour. Just want to say a very big thank you to you for being here, sharing yourself authentically, and helping lead us into authentic paths ourselves. So my name is Lauren Wagner. I'm with the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network Detroit. And thank you, Charnay, for being such a great partner, and COACT for being such a great partner on these series. If you're interested in getting engaged with the YNPN Detroit, we are taking memberships for board members and things like that. So always all kinds of opportunities to continue to lead authentically. So here in Detroit, thank you everyone so much. And I will I think I'll lead us out now. We are all done today. Let you on to your next appointments and your next meetings. Feel free to stick around if you have questions though.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Oh.